Racing Roundtable time. Nick Tamero here as we recap a fun weekend of racing from a few different points around the globe, more so on the Western Hemisphere. We're going to take a look at that. I'll be joined by my esteemed colleagues Vance Hansen and Darren Zocali. We'll go one by one as we look through some of this action, recapping what we saw, looking forward to the Breeders' Cup as well. Horses we're looking to back potentially in less than 3 weeks at Del Mar, and some that we're looking to maybe take a bit of a swing against. Vance, we're going to get right into it and start with you. I know that your eye-catching moment took place a little north of the border. Tell us more about it.
Actually, mine was right in my backyard. It was the Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup at Keeneland, which I was out to witness. It was the most important race domestically last weekend, and we'd seen She Feels Pretty win impressively before, but not quite in this manner and against this level of competition. After a couple narrow losses in New York over the summer, trainer Cherie DeVoe and jockey John Velasquez agreed it was best to add blinkers to her equipment and to keep the filly covered up early on in this race. She had been losing focus in New York and kind of idling when ranging up beside some of her competition. But everything worked out to an absolute T on Saturday at Keeneland. She was covered up until the quarter pole, tipped out to the two path, and then just stormed home, won by 6 lengths, which was a record margin for this 40-year-old race, and the time was spectacular. 146 and 2 for a mile and an eighth. Surprisingly, not a stakes record. Memories of Silver still owns that. She covered the distance in like 145 and change a long time ago. But this was definitely a breakout performance, I thought, by She Feels Pretty. You'd think that, they'd probably consider the American Oaks at the end of December, but I think off of this performance, I think she would deserve a shot at the 1 mile matriarch at Del Mar on the 1st of December. She'd be facing older rivals for the first time, and that's been a race that's been difficult for 3-year-olds to win in the last decade, but last year Surge Capacity bolted up and won that race off a relatively minor victory in the Valley View Stakes at Keeneland. So you'd think Chad Brown would have the fillies and mares to beat again in the matriarch like he often does, but off of this performance by She Feels Pretty on Saturday, I think she would be a pretty good fit.
No doubt about it. Darren, what did you think of She Feels Pretty's tour de force in the QE2?
Yeah, we talked about her on the jury last week and kind of waiting for this effort, right? Like the movement from age 2 to age 3. She's had a couple of narrow defeats prior to this year, and I guess we were waiting to see her fulfill all of that potential and put together this kind of captivating performance, and she certainly did that. Most impressive winner of this race that I can remember, and certainly an exciting time to take a look at her going forward from age 3 to age 4 as well, and to see how she stacks up against the older fillies and mares and what she'll be facing with Chad Brown's arsenal, of course, next year as well, and how her career continues to pan out, because she is still very lightly raced. So certainly, the ceiling for her is nowhere to be found at this point. And I thought it was just obviously visually extremely impressive. It was an incredibly quick time. They had her ready to go. It was the best race of her career, and it shows the true talent that she is, and certainly just an awe-inspiring performance that leaves me, really wanting more from her in the rest of her career, because right now the sky's the limit for her.
Yeah, she obviously had shown some tremendous ability as a 2-year-old, and I think the hasty reaction was to think that maybe she hadn't gone on at 3, but you start to pick apart some of those races she had run in, including the Lake Placid, and that was a pretty strong inside bias on the inner turf course that week when the rail came down, and I think being 3 wide on the chase really worked against her, but she did look like a more complete horse. Look, we've seen Chad Brown do incredibly well adding blinkers to turf horses, and Cherie DeVoe, of course, is a Chad Brown disciple, so no surprise that equipment change made a big difference. I thought the fact that she was so handy, as Vance alluded to, really is her best weapon, right? She's got a lot of speed for a filly that can go the mile to mile and an eighth trip successfully. So I think that'll really help her at a place like Del Mar if she does end up going for the matriarch. I don't imagine they're going to give too much consideration to a mile and eighth try in the Breeders' Cup. We have seen horses come back off this QE2 and run in the Breeders' Cup. Modge nearly won the mile last year off of a win in the QE2, but hoping that maybe discretion is the better part of valor there. So I would look forward to seeing her maybe in one of those Grade 1 objectives a little bit later on down the line. Now, one of you wanted to talk about the Glorious song. I thought it was Vance. Apparently it was Darren. I will not call out the production team on that. That's my fault for not verifying beforehand. So, Darren, tell us about what happened north of the border.
Yeah, so in the Glorious Song, which is for 2-year-old fillies, Winterberry ran what I thought was a spectacular race. Mark Cassie had half the field in here. She ran an extremely quick time on the day. If you saw her debut, you knew that there was a lot of a talent. If you follow the Ragazine sheets, a 2-year-old filly debuting with a 12 3/4 Ragazine number is pretty quick. She regressed a little bit off of that first performance, which sometimes happens, and now rounded back to the good effort here. The buyer came back a little bit light. It came back a 74, despite the fact that it was almost a second faster than the juvenile colt counterpart, which was run in the race prior, and that race received the 72. So it looks like they might have split the day in between the two-year-old races, but there were some other quick times, including later on in the day. I thought it was going to receive a loftier buyer number than that, and I'm curious to see where they go from here. A logical thing would be to stretch her out in the Mazarine Stakes, which is on Breeders' Cup weekend. If she comes back out of this quickly enough and good enough, they might target that. But Mark Cassie obviously has no shortage of juveniles in Canada, as he seems to dominate the entry box in these type of races. But we'll see if she can get around 2 turns, Nick. Certainly right now, she's got 2 out of her 3 performances that make you realize that she is an extremely quick filly that is high on talent. And definitely curious to see where she goes from here and how her career pans out, because she looks sensational on Sunday.
Yeah, daughter of Frosted with a good damn sight pedigree. Definitely one geared towards stretching out, I would think. So we'll see where they end up finding a spot for her. Obviously, there's about, a month and a half of racing left at Woodbine, closer to 2 months. So definitely some potential objectives there. But no doubt a solid performance from a budding star, potentially, among 2-year-old fillies. Well, guys, we're less than 3 weeks away from the Breeders' Cup, and obviously that's going to be a big part of the conversation here and everywhere as we head towards it. We wanted to touch on a couple of horses that we will be looking forward to betting potentially and looking forward to fading. Darren, you just touched on Woodbine, but give us a little bit of a sense of a horse that you're looking forward to putting some dollars down on in a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, if you followed me in Twinspires content or on Twitter, you know that I've been a fan of Forever Young for the better part of a year now. Since one of his races last year as a 2-year-old in Japan, I bet him in the Kentucky Derby, where he obviously ran a winning race. And don't forget that Derma Sotogake came out of the Kentucky Derby last year off a 6-month layoff to run second, a very good second, to White Barrio in what was a relatively weak Breeders' Cup Classic last year. This year certainly does seem to have a little bit more talent than perhaps the field last year, but I think Forever Young's a better horse than Derma Sotogake, and he has a prep race prior to this that I thought was fantastic. The time on the surface, if you don't follow Japan racing, might look slow. It was not. Japanese dirt tracks are very deep and sandy, and it was actually a relatively quick time when compared to 1.25 mile times at that track throughout the course of the year. He stumbled and still put himself in the race. He showed more early speed than he normally does, and he actually ran a better race than I thought he would off of the 5-month layoff. He's well-traveled. He shows that whatever you throw at him, he can handle and handle it quite well. He overcame a wide trip in Dubai. He overcame a wide trip in the Kentucky Derby. He had to deal with a lot of bumping throughout the stretch from Sierra Leone in the Kentucky Derby that you can argue might have cost him the race. But I just think this is a fantastic racehorse. He wants every bit of the 1.25 miles. If he's actually going to show a little bit more tactical speed and get himself into the race a little bit sooner, I think he's got as good a chance as any. And with City of Troy coming and maybe getting some of the international buzz, fierceness coming off of a big win over Torpedo Anna in the Travers Stakes, perhaps there's going to be some money going elsewhere, which, I think 5-1, if you get it on Forever Young, is a realistic price and really is representative of his chances to win this race. And I am very much looking forward to betting him in the Breeders' Cup Classic.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. The anti-post got him between 4 and 6-1 right now. I don't completely trust those because I think the price on City of Troy is a little depressed in those markets, being that he's more or less from the home team. But I would imagine Forever Young's going to be popular among the American bettors just based on the way he ran in the Kentucky Derby, and justifiably. He ran a tremendous race that day. I think the other factor that we can't really make too many plans for, at least at this point, is how well the Japanese do that weekend. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the chances are very good that they snag at least one win, if not two. I think 19 horses are slated to come over. Vance, you're a guy who spent a lot of time looking at international racing. What are your thoughts on Forever Young?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of Darren's sentiments. I mean, the bettors are going to really like him off of that Kentucky Derby performance, and as he said, that prep race last week was a really good one. And as you mentioned, the Japanese were in force the last time the Breeders' Cup was at Del Mar. They walked away with a couple of victories, including some surprises. He won't be much of a surprise if he wins this.
If I made the over under 1.5 on Japanese wins at the Breeders' Cup, are you playing the over?
I might actually just go to the under. I'm not too versed on all of the Japanese entrants that are coming over, but just to be on the conservative side, I would take the under.
At some point, you're going to be able to fade them and actually have some help in the betting markets, no doubt about it. But Vance, who is your horse you're looking forward to betting at this point?
I think Mulliken is entering the Breeders' Cup Sprint kind of with the wind at his sails. He's won all 4 starts this season for trainer Rudy Brissett, generally by wide margins, including the John Nehrude at Belmont, and then a spectacular win in the Forego at Saratoga. 7 furlongs has been kind of his forte during this span, but his record over 6 furlongs is pretty good too. He's versatile in style. He can win on the front end or from a stalking position. And to me, he just simply has a lot going for him at the moment. I've seen some anti-post odds that have him pegged around 5-1, 6-1, 3 weeks out, and I'd take that price all day long on this horse, especially since some of his potential rivals, the Chosen Vron, the Nakatomi, have fallen short in the sprint in the past. And Skelly, very fast horse, but he seemingly has stamina issues at this level of competition. So Mulliken is a horse. The one horse I think is my one I'm really looking forward to on Breeders' Cup weekend.
You alluded to him seemingly having the versatility to sit a little bit off the pace if that's what's necessary. It seems like this field really, maybe above all, is so much in flux with horses like Skelly and Straight No Chaser, who are right now considered possible. They would obviously have a huge impact on this race from a pace perspective. And I know Mulliken more or less dominated on the front end last time in the Forego. That undoubtedly contributed to his pretty significant winning margin. You're not all that worried about him having to potentially go into a stalking role?
No, not at all, and not based on a few of his races this year. I think he's quite versatile, and I think the fact that he's been specializing in longer races too, I would expect his stamina to hold out a lot better than some of the others.
Darren, Mulliken, a horse you have any affinity for?
Yeah, I think right now it's kind of hard to know exactly what that field's going to look like, and you kind of alluded to that earlier. I prefer him to the Chosen Vron, who's actually the horse that I'm looking to playing against, and for one of the reasons, Mulliken being in the race. And I just think that the Chosen Vron hasn't run into anything close to Mulliken yet. And there's others in there. Federal Judge has certainly come alive of late. If he goes there, is another horse that I think you need to pay very close attention to. And so for me, I think Mulliken, right now the world is his oyster. I mean, he's plenty quick enough, running good figures. And the Chosen Vron, while I certainly do respect him, I do question a little bit the fields that he's beaten. I don't think he's faced anything the caliber of Mulliken or some of the others that he's going to see. And the fact that the Breeders' Cup is in California and in Southern California, this horse is still going to take a lot of money, even though he finished second last time out in the Pat O'Brien. I still think he's going to get bet, and I think he's a horse that you can fade and play against and still build your tickets around others and make some value. And Mulliken is certainly one that's going to be on my tickets as well as a few others. So for all the reasons that Vance said and more, I do like Mulliken, and it's a reason that the Chosen Vron is a horse that I'm actually looking forward to playing against Breeders' Cup Saturday.
Yes, for all the bloodthirsty types out there that might be annoyed by me saying this, thinking the chosen Vron is really cool while also thinking he's overrated are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
You definitely can believe them both at the same time. I know I do. And he's a horse I'd be looking forward to fading as well. Mulligan, interesting. Obviously, an up and coming type. First grade one winner for Rudy Brissett, who's had a pretty tremendous Keeneland meet and a great second half of the year with a couple of really talented horses that we've seen from his barn. Well, we touched on horses we were going to fade in the horses we're going to bet segment. So let's talk about horses we're looking forward to fading. Vance, kick us off with who you're looking to take a swing against in the Breeders' Cup.
Well, I have several in mind, and some of the grass races, the fields are still in flux, so I'll wait on to have an opinion on those races. But one I will mention right now is Ways and Means in the Filly and Mare Sprint. This race has been around since 2007, and only a trio of 3-year-olds have ever won it. The most recent were Kofefe in 2019 and Gamine in 2020. I don't quite think Ways and Means quite measures up to those two just yet. I could be wrong, but just going into this race, I don't think she's quite their caliber. She's an outstanding one-turn specialist, don't get me wrong, but I think she was perhaps a little flattered competing over off tracks, winning the Test Stakes at Saratoga and the Gallant Bloom at Aqueduct. She was also an odds-on choice in both of those races, so the depth of those two races certainly has to be called into question. And another point I would make is that the older ranks in this division is pretty solid. Now, I don't know if Sweet Azteca is going to be up to the task off of her recent upset loss in the Chillingworth, but we do have a couple of other intriguing older fillies and mares pointing for this race. Vava basically owned the division in the first half of the season, and then Society, who's only had a limited number of starts since coming back from a long layoff. She ran arguably the best race of her career in the Ballerina while demonstrating she might no longer be a one-dimensional frontrunner. So I think from my perspective, a few weeks out, those two at the very least figure to offer a little bit more value vis-a-vis Ways and Means.
Darren, what did you think about Ways and Means?
Yeah, I mean, look, she's one of those fillies that's extremely high on talent. Obviously she was trying to go a little bit longer and ran into, a horse like Torpedo Ann in the Kentucky Oaks. I do think she's facing a tough battle. Lightly raced with upside. I certainly respect her speed and I respect her ability. And she's shown a lot of versatility in her career, and certainly she's given us some good moments and run some big races, especially most recently at Saratoga. But that all being said, she's also at times beaten up on fields that are just lesser than she is. That's not going to be the case in the Breeders' Cup Filly Mare Sprint. Chad Brown always takes a lot of money. So I don't think you're going to get the value that you should probably demand on a filly like this in the spot like that. So I tend to agree with Vance when it comes to this specific race.
Chad would be bidding for his fourth win in the Filly and Mare Sprint and his third straight, having won each of the last two runnings. We'll get a little bit of a line on Ways and Means with Emery running in the Raven Run on Saturday at Keeneland. The morning line maker at Keeneland made her the 7-5 morning line favorite, but he's a little bit tough to trust at times, so we won't get into that terribly much. But that'll give us some insight because she was vanquished by Ways and Means in the test back in early August at Saratoga. As far as your fade, Darren, where are you looking?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. So, the chosen Vron, I won't beat up too much on it, but for the reasons that Van said, the fact that I don't think that he's been facing the strongest of competition. And, you added to it as well. It's one thing to think that he's a really cool horse, and it's another thing to be able to say that he's overrated. I mean, I've said that about some of my favorite horses. Funny Side was a horse that was an extremely cool horse, and he gave you great moments from time to time, and every once in a while jumped up and ran a monster race. But, let's be honest, Funny Side was not the greatest horse of all time. It's okay to say that. And when it comes to betting, Funny Side ran in the Breeders' Cup Classic twice, was going to take a lot of money in both those races because he was a cool horse. And on top of that, he had no chance in either race. And you were able to lay Funny Side at 6-1, 7-1, whatever he was, when he really should have been 25-1. The chosen Vron is going to be, close to favored, maybe second choice. And it's the same type of profile. So yeah, for the same reasons, I'm going to fade the chosen Vron. Because I already talked about him, I'll throw one more out there real quick. Farbridge is coming off back-to-back wins going into the Breeders' Cup Turf. I don't know how much money he's going to take, guys, but every time a horse from the U.S. gets hot and goes into the Breeders' Cup Turf, I play against them. Until I'm shown otherwise, European runners, Japanese runners. They're just better than the American turf runners. And Farbridge, for me, if he takes any type of action there, is a horse that I'm going to be playing against in the Breeders' Cup Turf as well.
I think that makes sense. I don't know really. I guess he'll be he'll be the shortest price of the American contingent. Now that We're Like Goddess will end up going to the filly and mare turf with it being a mile and 3/8. So Rebels Romance right now looks like one of the anti-post favorites. We'll see where he ends up. He's actually going to be looking for his second Breeders' Cup turf in 3 years, having scored at Keeneland a couple of years ago. He comes in with a similar type of approach. I'll leave that kind of conversation to Vance when we get closer to the event because that's more in his wheelhouse. But I do think those are reasonable fades. One horse that I wanted to just mention, and I didn't. I'm throwing this at Lance without having sent him anything. But I'm going to be careful about Chancer McPatrick and the Juvenile. I know that might be a little bit of an on the limb type of approach, but I don't love that horse's style for 2 turns at Del Mar. We're going to have to pay really close attention Thursday and the early part of Friday if we have more of the 2024 Del Mar main track as opposed to the 2023 and earlier version where outside moves really were advantageous. It's a very speed-favoring dirt track at Del Mar this summer, and he's a horse who's going to be a really short price relative to the horses that he's facing. I think we've seen a lot of fast horses in there, so he undoubtedly should get a good setup, but I'm also not convinced that running style really lends itself to 2 turns. He might be a horse that really caps out at 7 furlongs to a mile, and you kind of wonder a bit after he made that big move on the turn at Aqueduct and then idled a little bit before he kind of kicked it in again, if he might be one that distance-wise is limited to the mile or so. There'll be plenty of objectives for him down the line if that does end up being the case, but he's in the spot that he deserves to be in based on what we've seen thus far from his body of work. Well, guys, that's all that we were going to cover on here. I'll see you later in the week, I believe, for the jury coming up on Thursday. Thanks so much, and we'll look forward to it.
Thanks.